You know what it feels like? You walk into a room and suddenly you're carrying weight that isn't yours. The tension between two people who are smiling at each other but seething underneath. The grief someone is hiding behind their jokes. The anxiety that's filling the space even though nobody's naming it. You feel all of it. Not as some vague sense, but as something visceral, something that lives in your body like it belongs to you. And you're exhausted. Not just tired, but exhausted in a way that sleep doesn't fix. Because you've been absorbing the emotional overflow of everyone around you for so long that you can't remember what your own feelings actually are anymore. You've been told to toughen up, to stop taking things so personally, to grow thicker skin. As if your skin is the problem. As if you're defective somehow. Built wrong for a world that requires you to be less of what you are. You've learned to apologize for your depth. You make yourself smaller in conversations because you see too much, and people get uncomfortable when you reflect back what they're trying to hide. You've been called too sensitive so many times that you've started to believe it's a diagnosis rather than a description. You second-guess what you feel because trusting your perception has led to isolation. And isolation feels like proof that something is wrong with you. But here's the thing. What if nothing is wrong with you? What if the problem isn't your sensitivity at all? What if the problem is a world that's become so desensitized, so numb, so disconnected from genuine feeling that it can no longer recognize wisdom when it sees it? Think about it. We live in a time when people are more connected than ever through technology and more lonely than ever in their actual lives. When surface-level interaction has replaced depth, when everyone is performing a version of themselves rather than being themselves. And in this landscape of pretense and performance, you, the empath, are feeling the truth of what's actually happening. You see, empaths aren't broken receivers picking up signals they shouldn't be getting. They're exceptional perceivers who've retained a capacity that most people have systematically dulled. There are creatures in nature that can sense storms coming hours before they arrive. Birds that know when earthquakes are about to hit and flee before the ground starts shaking. Wolves that can smell fear and illness and intention from distances that seem impossible. They aren't magical. They're paying attention to subtle changes in their environment that save their lives. The empath is like this. You're picking up on the subtle, energetic, and emotional shifts that others have learned to ignore. You're reading the data that's actually there. The information that exists beneath the words people speak and the faces they show the world. Most people have been trained out of this capacity. They've learned to override their gut feelings, to dismiss their intuitive hits, to trust logic over instinct even when logic is leading them toward disaster. They've built walls so thick around their hearts that they can't feel their own pain, let alone anyone else's. And then they call you too sensitive for still being able to feel. For still being connected to the most sophisticated guidance system human beings possess. Let me tell you about 4 kinds of strength that look like sensitivity. 4 powers that this world has convinced you are problems when they're actually your greatest gifts. The first power is emotional literacy. You can read what's unspoken, not as some mystical ability, but as a refined skill that you've developed whether you meant to or not. You understand the subtext of human interaction, because you're fluent in a language most people can barely speak anymore. You read micro-expressions, the way someone's energy shifts when a certain topic comes up, the weight of silence when someone says they're fine but they're clearly not, the incongruence between words and truth. You know when someone is lying, not because you're paranoid or suspicious, but because you feel the gap between what they're saying and what they're actually experiencing. I knew a woman who sensed her best friend's marriage was ending 6 months before anyone else knew there was a problem. She couldn't explain how she knew. There were no obvious signs. Her friend spoke about her husband the same way she always had. They still showed up to gatherings together, still smiled in photos, still maintained the appearance of contentment. But something had shifted, something subtle in the energy between them, a distance that looked like closeness but felt empty. The woman said it was like watching two actors perform a marriage rather than watching two people live one. She felt the ending before it began, and it haunted her because she couldn't say anything. How do you tell someone their marriage is dying when they haven't admitted it to themselves yet? How do you name what everyone else is determined not to see? This is what emotional literacy costs you. You carry truths that others refuse to acknowledge. You feel the disconnection underneath the performance, the loneliness inside the small talk, the desperation beneath the success stories. You sit in conversations where everyone is pretending everything is fine, and you feel the fractures in that pretense like splinters under your skin. You become the keeper of emotional truths that have nowhere to go because no one else wants to hold them. This exhausts you. This isolates you. This makes you feel crazy. Because you're surrounded by people who've learned to look away from what's real, and you can't stop seeing it. You're living in full color while everyone else has adjusted to a grayscale existence, and they can't understand why you're so overwhelmed by what they've learned to tune out. They tell you you're too much, too intense, too deep. And after a while, you start to believe that your perception is the problem, that your ability to feel and see and know is a burden rather than a gift. But what if your exhaustion isn't from feeling too much? What if it's from constantly being told that what you're feeling isn't real? What if it's from suppressing your knowing, apologizing for your depth, dimming your perception to fit into a world that rewards emotional blindness? What if the problem isn't your sensitivity, but your lack of permission to trust it? Trust it. That's where the second power lives. In the trust. I know what you're thinking. Trust my feelings. In a world like this, that's not power. That's suicide. That's naive at best, dangerous at worst. You've been burned enough times by trusting what you felt. You've been told you were wrong, overreacting, reading into things, and so you learned to dismiss the very thing that was trying to guide you. But here's the thing. That reaction, that immediate resistance to trusting your own knowing, that's exactly the proof of how deeply we've been conditioned. They told you to be logical. They told you to be rational. They told you to ignore your gut. And in doing so, they disconnected you from the most sophisticated guidance system you possess. Because logic without intuition is just calculation. Rationality without feeling is just mechanism, and you can calculate and mechanize yourself right into situations that your body knew were wrong from the beginning. The second power is energetic influence, and this is where it gets interesting, because empaths aren't just feeling energy. They're shifting it. They're not passive sponges soaking up whatever emotional weather happens to be in the room. They're transformers. Alchemists operating on a frequency most people don't even know exists. You've experienced this even if you haven't named it. You walk into a room where tension is thick enough to cut, and somehow, without saying anything particularly profound, the tension starts to dissolve. People relax, the energy shifts, or you sit with someone who's in pain and they finally exhale, finally let go of something they've been holding. And they say they don't know why, but they feel better. They feel seen. Not because you gave them advice or fixed anything, but because something about your presence made it safe to feel what they were feeling. This isn't magic. This is nervous system regulation happening through presence alone. Your nervous system, when it's grounded, when it's regulated, literally helps regulate other nervous systems. Empaths create safety through authentic presence. They mirror emotions in a way that helps others process what they're carrying. It's like emotional digestion. Most people are walking around with unprocessed feelings stuck in their bodies because they have no space to actually feel them, no permission to acknowledge what's real. And then they encounter an empath who isn't afraid of feeling, who doesn't flinch away from emotion, and suddenly there's room to breathe, room to be honest, room to stop performing. Think about it. Think about the person who always ends up being the one people confess their secrets to. Not because they ask probing questions or pry into private matters, but because something about their presence makes truth feel possible. People tell them things they've never told anyone else. Strangers open up to them in grocery store lines. Friends call them at 3 in the morning, not because they have solutions, but because they create space for what's real. This is power. Real power. The power to create space for authenticity in a world that's drowning in performance. The power to hold emotional complexity without trying to fix it or flee from it. The power to witness someone's humanity without judgment or advice or trying to make it more comfortable. Just presence. Just being able to be with what is. But we don't recognize this as power because it's invisible. We measure power by what we can see. Physical strength is obvious. You can measure how much someone can lift, how fast they can run, how hard they can hit. Intellectual dominance is trackable. Test scores and degrees and positions and titles. We know how to quantify those things. We know how to respect them. But the power to shift the emotional field of a room, the power to help someone feel safe enough to stop hiding, the power to transform tension into ease through nothing but authentic presence. This gets dismissed as being nice, as emotional labor, as women's work. It gets diminished, feminized, made small and insignificant, and taken for granted. Because if we can't measure it, if we can't put a number on it, if it doesn't come with a certificate or a paycheck or visible results, then it must not be real power. Except it is. It's the most profound form of power there is because it operates at the level of being rather than doing. It changes the field itself rather than just moving pieces around within the field. And empaths do this naturally, unconsciously, often without even realizing they're doing it. Which means imagine what becomes possible when they do it consciously. Now, I'm not saying empaths are saints. I'm not saying sensitivity equals goodness. What I'm saying is that empaths have a third power that makes them uniquely equipped to navigate a world built on lies. They can't be easily manipulated because they feel the incongruence between words and truth. They're human lie detectors, not through cynicism or suspicion, but through sensitivity to what's actually happening beneath what's being said. You feel when energy doesn't match the message, when someone's words are saying one thing, but their presence is communicating something else entirely. When a situation looks good on paper but feels wrong in your body. When marketing and manipulation and manufactured image are trying to sell you a story that doesn't align with reality. Everyone else might be nodding along, buying in, believing the narrative, but you feel the gap. You feel the lie underneath the performance. This is power in a world that runs on manipulation. While everyone else is being sold stories about what they should want, who they should be, what success looks like, what happiness requires, the empath is feeling the truth underneath. They're sensing that the emperor has no clothes even when everyone else is complimenting his wardrobe. They're feeling the rot beneath the polished surface. the emptiness inside the pretty package, the violence wrapped in civilized language. This makes empaths dangerous, not physically dangerous, but dangerous to systems that rely on collective illusion, dangerous to power structures that depend on people not trusting their own perception, dangerous to anyone who needs others to believe their performance rather than feel their truth. Because you can't fool an empath. Not for long. Not in any way that matters. They might not be able to explain how they know. They might not have evidence or proof or logical arguments, but they know. They feel it. And that knowing is a threat to anything built on deception. And yes, this means you stand alone sometimes, feeling the truth of something while everyone around you agrees on the comfortable lie. And that loneliness cuts deeper than any sword because humans are tribal creatures, and to sense what the tribe refuses to see is to risk exile. And exile is an ancient fear, written into your bones, passed down through generations of ancestors who knew that being cast out from the group meant death. Which is why you've learned to doubt yourself, to question your own perception, to wonder if maybe you're the crazy one after all, because crazy and alone feels safer than sane and exiled. But here's what they never tell you about exile. Here's what happens when you stop running from your own knowing. Here's the fourth power, and it's the one that changes everything. The fourth power is alchemy. The power to transform suffering into wisdom. Not just your suffering, everyone's suffering. Let me be clear, I'm not talking about pretending pain doesn't hurt. I'm not talking about being grateful for trauma or finding the silver lining in abuse or any of that spiritual bypassing nonsense that tells people to smile through their wounds. I'm talking about something far more profound. I'm talking about the capacity to transmute emotional energy itself, to take what would break most people and forge it into something that serves. Not because suffering is good or necessary, but because empaths have been in the depths and survived, which means they know the territory. They know the landscape of human pain intimately. Every valley, every cliff edge, every place where people get lost. And that knowledge, that hard-won familiarity with darkness, makes them natural guides for others who find themselves in those same depths. Think about how diamonds are formed, carbon subjected to immense pressure deep in the earth, or how the strongest trees are the ones that had to grow roots deep enough to survive the worst storms. The ones in sheltered gardens with perfect conditions stay shallow. They topple in the first real wind. But the tree that had to dig deep, that had to find water when there was drought and anchor itself when there were gales, that tree becomes unshakable. The empath's depth of feeling isn't a flaw in the design. It's the feature that creates wisdom. But there's a shift that has to happen. A fundamental transformation in how you relate to your own sensitivity. Because there's unconscious empathy and there's conscious empathy, and they're completely different experiences. Unconscious empathy is absorption. It's being a sponge for everything around you, soaking up everyone's emotions until you can't tell what's yours and what isn't. It's exhaustion and overwhelm and feeling like a victim of other people's emotional states. It's having no control, no agency, no ability to protect yourself from the constant onslaught of feeling that isn't even yours. Conscious empathy is something else entirely. It's choosing what you engage with. It's understanding that boundaries aren't walls meant to keep feeling out, but channels meant to direct feeling consciously. It's learning to use your sensitivity as a tool rather than being used by it. What if your boundaries aren't meant to keep feeling out, but to help you direct feeling consciously? What if protection isn't about building walls, but about becoming so rooted in your own center that you can feel everything without being swept away by it? What if the goal isn't to feel less, but to feel more skillfully? Someone I knew spent years being drained by their empathy, absolutely exhausted by it. They would go to dinner with friends and come home needing 3 days to recover. They would have a conversation with someone who was struggling and end up carrying that person's pain for weeks. They felt responsible for everyone's emotional state. If someone was upset, they believed it was their job to fix it, absorb it, take it away somehow. And they were dying from it, slowly being crushed under the weight of emotions that weren't theirs to carry. But something shifted, not all at once, not through some dramatic awakening or healing moment. Gradually, through attention and practice and 1,000 small choices, they began to notice the difference between their own emotions and absorbed emotions. They started to recognize the moment when they were crossing from observation into absorption. That subtle shift from being with someone's pain to becoming their pain. They learned to feel someone's suffering without making it their own, to hold space without holding the burden. They would sit with someone in distress, and instead of drowning in the emotion, they became the shore. They felt it, yes. They understood it completely. But they didn't become it. And in that space, in that conscious presence that feels but doesn't merge, they found their power. They discovered they could actually be more helpful, more present, more genuinely supportive when they weren't trying to rescue or fix or take away. When they could just be there, grounded and clear, creating space for whatever needed to be felt. This is where it gets revolutionary. Because conscious empaths are dangerous to the status quo. They can't be manipulated by fear because they've already been to the bottom of fear and found it survivable. They can't be controlled by shame because they've held shame and watched it transmute. They can't be sold illusions because they feel the emptiness underneath the marketing. They see through the systems that keep most people trapped in cycles of consumption and distraction and manufactured need. They will try to convince you you're too sensitive. They will try to medicate your awareness. They will try to make you doubt what you feel. Because if you trust what you feel, if you use what you feel, if you become conscious with what you feel, you become ungovernable. You can't be controlled by people who need you to ignore your knowing. You can't be manipulated by systems that rely on your disconnection from truth. You become a threat simply by being authentic in a world that runs on pretense. And here's what happens when empaths stop hiding. When they stop apologizing for their depth. When they stop dimming their perception to make others comfortable. They create permission for everyone around them to be real. One authentic person in a room full of performance creates a crack in the facade, and cracks let light in. The collective trance of pretending starts to dissolve. Not because the empath is preaching or trying to save anyone, but because authenticity is contagious. Truth is magnetic. When one person stops performing, it gives everyone else permission to stop too. This isn't about saving the world. It's about what shifts when authentic people stop performing. The ripple effect of one person choosing reality over illusion. The way honesty creates space for more honesty. The way depth calls to depth. Empaths who claim their power become nodes of authenticity in a landscape of pretense. They build pockets of reality in a world of illusion. But let me be honest with you. It's hard. It's lonely sometimes. You'll lose people who only loved your performance, who needed you to stay small and accommodating and endlessly available. You'll outgrow spaces that require your silence about what you see and feel. You'll watch relationships end because they were built on your willingness to absorb without boundaries. to give without receiving, to pretend things were fine when they weren't. But you'll find your people. Not by seeking them or trying to convince them or performing your authenticity for approval. You'll find them by being so genuinely yourself that they recognize you. Like calls to like. Truth calls to truth. And empaths who've claimed their power, who've made that shift from unconscious absorption to conscious alchemy, they find each other. They recognize the frequency. They build something different together. Not perfect, not pain-free, but real. Rooted in what's actually true rather than what's comfortable to pretend. So how do you actually do this? How do you move from unconscious absorption to conscious alchemy? How do you claim this power without losing your heart in the process? Let me tell you something. I know all of this, the powers, the alchemy, the consciousness. It can feel overwhelming. You're tired. You've been tired for so long, and now I'm telling you that your exhaustion is actually a sign of your power? That sounds cruel. It sounds like another burden piled onto shoulders that are already carrying too much. Like I'm asking you to turn your pain into some kind of spiritual assignment. But that's not what I'm saying at all. The exhaustion you feel isn't from feeling too much. It's from fighting what you feel, from trying to be normal in a world that has a very narrow definition of what normal means, from apologizing for your depth, from constantly dimming your light to make others comfortable, from suppressing your knowing because it makes people uneasy, from performing a version of yourself that's acceptable instead of being the version that's true. The empathy itself isn't what's draining you. The resistance to it is. Think about swimming. When you swim against a current, every stroke exhausts you. You're fighting the water, working twice as hard to move half as far. But when you swim with the current, the same energy carries you. The water that was your enemy becomes your ally. Your empathy is like that current. You've been fighting it your whole life, trying to make it smaller, trying to control it, trying to fit it into a shape that other people can accept. And that fight is what's killing you. The same energy that exhausts you fighting your nature will fuel you when you finally align with it. You begin to notice the difference between your emotions and absorbed emotions. Not through some technique you master, but through awareness you cultivate. Your anxiety has a familiar flavor. It has a texture, a frequency that you've come to know. Absorbed anxiety feels foreign, even when it's intense. It sits differently in your body. It has a quality that doesn't quite match your internal landscape. This isn't something you learn from a book or a workshop. You learn it by paying attention, by being curious about what you feel rather than being ruled by it, by asking where this feeling is actually coming from instead of just drowning in it. You learn what restores you, not what Instagram says should restore you, not what the self-care industry is selling you, but what actually works for your specific system. For some people, it's solitude, real solitude, not just being alone while scrolling through other people's lives. For others, it's nature, getting their hands in dirt, their feet on earth, their body in water. For others, still, it's creative expression, making something, moving their body, singing, writing, painting. You stop following other people's recipes and start trusting your own knowing about what you need. Boundaries become something different, not walls you build to keep the world out, but conscious choices about what you engage with and how. A boundary isn't a rejection. It's not mean or selfish or cold. It's permission to feel someone's pain without fixing it, to witness someone's journey without joining it, to care deeply without carrying what isn't yours to carry. It's understanding that you can be compassionate and boundaried at the same time. That saying no to what depletes you is saying yes to what sustains you. But let me be honest about something else. The shadow side. Because empathy isn't inherently good. Sensitivity isn't the same as virtue. An empath who hasn't done their own work, who hasn't faced their own darkness, can use their gift to control and manipulate just as easily as they can use it to heal. Maybe more easily, because people trust empaths. We assume sensitivity equals safety. It doesn't. An empath can read you and use that information against you. They can sense your wounds and poke them. They can hide behind helping others to avoid facing their own pain. They can become martyrs, addicted to being needed, to being the one everyone relies on. They can use their sensitivity as an excuse to avoid responsibility, to stay stuck, to make their perception of others' feelings more important than their own growth. You see, consciousness isn't the same as goodness. Power isn't the same as virtue. And the work of becoming a conscious empath requires brutal honesty with yourself first. It requires looking at the ways you've used your sensitivity to manipulate, to control, to avoid. The ways you've hidden behind helping others. The ways you've made yourself indispensable to people so you wouldn't have to face your own emptiness. The ways you've confused codependence with compassion. This isn't comfortable work, but it's necessary work. Because unconscious empathy, even well-intentioned, can cause as much harm as it heals. We're living in a time of profound disconnection. More connected than ever through technology, and more lonely than ever in our actual lives. We have connection without presence, interaction without intimacy, communication without understanding. And in this landscape, empaths who've done their work, who've claimed their consciousness, who've learned to be present without pretense, they're not just helpful, they're essential. The world doesn't need you to fix it. It needs you to be real in it. Every time you speak truth, you give someone else permission to stop lying. Every time you feel something and name it, you crack the veneer of pretense a little more. Every time you choose authenticity over performance, you make authenticity a little more possible for everyone else. This isn't about being perfect. It's about being genuine. It's about showing up as you actually are, rather than as you think you should be. Remember when I said empaths are the most powerful people? Not because they're better than others, not because they're more evolved or more spiritual or more worthy, but because they've retained something essential. They haven't forgotten how to feel. And in a world that's dying from emotional starvation, where people are numb and disconnected and desperately lonely while surrounded by others, the person who can feel, who can help others feel, who can create space for authentic presence, that person holds the key to the only revolution that matters. Not a political revolution or an economic revolution, but a revolution of presence, of realness, of human beings remembering how to actually be with each other. Power isn't about domination or force or winning some imagined competition where you prove you're stronger or smarter or better than everyone else. Real power is about presence. It's about being so grounded in your own truth that you create space for truth around you. It's about feeling everything and being broken by nothing. It's about transforming pain into wisdom, not by pretending the pain wasn't real, but by letting it teach you what it came to teach. It's about turning suffering into compassion, not the kind that makes you superior, but the kind that makes you human. It's about transforming isolation into connection by being brave enough to be real when everyone else is performing. So stop apologizing for your depth. Stop dimming your light because it makes people uncomfortable. Stop pretending you don't feel what you feel. Stop trying to be less sensitive, less intense, less of what you actually are. The world doesn't need another performance. It has enough of those. It needs your truth. It needs your presence. It needs empaths who've claimed their power, faced their shadows, done their work, and decided to show up as they actually are. You were never too sensitive. You were never too emotional. You were never too much. You were always exactly what was needed. A human being who still remembers how to be human in a world that's forgotten what that means. And in a world that's forgotten, that makes you dangerous. That makes you powerful. That makes you essential.